Ready? My live, can you hear me? Because I can't hear myself. You can hear me though, right? Yes, good. Okay, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everybody, for being here, because this is my absolute favorite event at PyCon, and partially because I'm a kid at heart, and partially because it's, I think, the most important thing that we do within the Python community. So I'm going to go through this talk, and we're going to sort of talk a little bit about learning and Python, then a little bit about Jupyter, and then a little bit about community. And let's start with, think about the first time you started programming, or the first time you started a new thing that you started learning. Joy, wonder, fun. Would you persist and keep doing it if it didn't have some element of those three? And I had the pleasure of working with a professor at University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis, and or St. Paul, and she works with, she's an engineering and entrepreneurship professor, and she's working with this group called OkGo, and they have really kind of revolutionized some really cool ways of communicating information to students. And I'm going to show you a little bit of it, but hang on. Okay, so there are a group of things, and they make these short videos, and then they have content that goes along with them. And this particular one is actually a fairly short video. Maybe it's not. Okay, let's see if this is it. All right, much better. Sorry, technical difficulties. So they make these short videos that illustrate a concept. And in this case, it was a 4-second snippet. But then they do something very clever with it. So think about, you're an instructor teaching physics, design, art. They also have everything set to music. It becomes a really interesting way to engage people with the content up front. And then they have scaffolding and curriculum that goes with each of these. And there's a series of exercises. There's another one that we'll look at just quickly, and no instruments were harmed in this thing. And I'm not showing the sound just because, in the interest of time, but basically there's music going. They're sitting in this car on this test track out in the desert, and basically right now they're creating music by manipulating different things in the car, and then they kind of continue on, and music is really, like, sound is digital signal processing, it's physics, it's putting things together, synthesizing information. And I don't want to move on to the next slide, but one of the things that Jupyter Notebooks, when it was IPython Notebooks, inspired me was it let you deliver engaging content right away, hook students, particularly students that may have been reluctant learners, or students that had been told, unfortunately, before that they weren't good in science and math, so therefore they can't learn how to program, which I fundamentally believe is false. And I think some of the best programmers I've worked with have been musicians, philosophers, English majors, people who can synthesize information and also communicate well. So I will leave you, this is already up on speaker deck, so you'll be able to do this. This is actually the start of a curriculum that I'm going to teach this summer to middle school and high school students at Cal Poly It's only going to be a 2 to 4 hour workshop, but what I'm going to do is use the notebooks to deliver some content like we just saw, but then also bring in different elements from different disciplines, recognizing that high school students or middle school students may have interests beyond science and math. They will talk about the history of the theremin. They will learn a little bit about digital signal processing by playing with some cool notebooks that other people have made. And it's a way to engage them where they're at and then kind of guide them and help them learn more. And really, the key is to give them something that sparks their interest that then they can continue to work on. One of the things that I spend a fair amount of time doing is learning about how people learn. And, you know, I live near the beach. I like the nature thing. I would love it if somebody did like a whole thing on just sea life and what that means. And I think learning, Herbert Simon was somebody who was like the really almost known as the father of cognitive science. And he had said the student learns by what the student does. And I think in many ways that's true. And the teacher can only influence what the student does to learn. And one of the things that we see a lot of is tutorials or how-to guides. And I think one of the things that tutorials and how-to guides leave out is the thing that drew me to programming when I was in 5th grade, which was exploring and trying to put things together and build things. And I don't want to lose sight of that cool, like, how do you make things work? So imagine if you were teaching a Python workshop to middle school, high school students, or even adults for that matter. What would you put in it? Well, you might look at why learn Python, and the Raspberry Pi Foundation has done a wonderful job of showing the many different things from music to art to science, animation, the fabulous robots that we saw this morning, which I totally want to play with, but I tend to hurt robots. I like to drive them up skateboard ramps, and I have done that with kids, and it's actually really fun because they learn about gravity very quickly. And I could go on my same first Lego League and first rant, but I'm not going to. But I think with Python, it's kind of hard. So where do you start? There's over 129,000 packages out there. So as a learner, you've got to figure out, okay, where do I start in this? And then you also, as a learner, you're asking yourself, will you be able to learn? Some people will view it as fear, or I'm going to be alone in this learning, or even question, especially if they've been told they're not good in math and science, that whether they can learn. And Philip Gao, who's a friend of mine at UCSD, has done some great research on that, and I would encourage folks that are in academia here that are interested in, or just interested in learning, take a look at some of his work, because it's really quite phenomenal. They'll also think about, how will I learn? So they might be a little panicked to start. And how do you get from over here to like happy with Blinka, the lovely CircuitPython snake? And people will think, oh, it's just a straight path. But those of us that have been teaching or worked with students of any kind realize, no, that's not how people learn. Really, how people learn is more this convoluted path of, you know, you learn a little, then you apply it, you kind of drop back, and then realize you don't know something else, and then you're kind of spiraling. And you know, to get to the point of mastery, you want to be able to apply things and be able to, in some ways, teach it to somebody else. So the next part of the talk really focuses a little bit more about Python and learning Python. And part of the reason that this section I put in very late last night or early this morning was part of a keynote that I did at PyCon Caribbean about teaching adults how to use Python. And I started with looking at how the language began. And I don't know if everybody knows, but it was based on a language called ABC. And Guido had actually said that the most important lesson he learned when he was younger was about sharing. Well, how does that apply to the language? And really, if we really get down to what programming languages are, whether they're robots or Python or something running on a supercomputer, Fortran, whatever, you're communicating your ideas. And you're not doing it just for the sake of the computer, because the computer doesn't really care what you give it. It'll tell you if it doesn't like something that you give it, but you're doing it to apply it to the real world. And F-strings, this was actually part of the other thing, but it's a fabulous new thing in Python 3. If you haven't tried it, I highly encourage you to do that. So remember, this came from a talk about teaching adults how to get started using Python. And one of the things that I had the opportunity to learn about when I was at PyCon UK was edge-blocks. And I have to say, I was absolutely phenomenally impressed, not just by all the educators that were there, but they had a whole track for students. And not only learning, but the things that students were doing. And Josh is an excellent example. I think you probably gathered from his talk, he's a very bright young man, but also he is a phenomenal teacher. I watched him sit with adults, his talk that he gave at PyCon UK, and really inspired people and made it so that they felt they could learn. And the reason I think it's really helpful for adults is the same way, is that you can visualize the concepts, play around with it quickly. Even as adults, even those of us that are really quick at typing probably can't type as quickly as we can drag and drop. So I think there's a way to kind of accelerate the learning and to understand what's going on. The other thing that I think was phenomenal, and you'll hear a little bit more about it probably today, is you. And it's an editor that I wish I had when I was learning way back when, but I will leave that goodness for later. And then something else for learning Python that not everybody is aware of is pythontutor.com, and we talked briefly about Philip Gao and his work in cognitive science and learning, and this is actually something where you can run Python programs, you can see it executing step by step, and then actually press a little button, like there's a little button here, somewhere in there, that says, I need help. And actually a live person will respond to your help. And one of the things he's looking at is how do you teach people at scale, but still have a human element in it. So the bottom line is Python's designed for your success in learning, and which isn't to say that it will be a simple journey. You'll still have to put in effort, but it is a manageable journey. And so as a student, you may ask, am I qualified to learn Python? I think absolutely. As an instructor, are you qualified to teach? Maybe. It kind of depends. And not everybody learns the same way. And so take that into account when you're working with people and helping them learn. As adults, we tend to learn best with a top-down approach because we have that experiences of our lifetime, and we tend to know concepts that we've learned over time, whereas younger folks tend to have more of a data-driven, how do the five senses work? How do you interact with something? And what is going on right now? And the two working together really is like the cornerstone of good curriculum. And so to switch gears a little bit to Jupyter, so why did IPython notebooks or Jupyter notebooks engage me when I first saw them? I think it was early 2013. And I stumbled across them, actually, looking at a project from MIT called Music 21. And at the time, I was actually learning or brushing up on Python. And whenever I learn a new computer language, I typically will find some projects in music or art that I enjoy and apply the language to that, because it's a little more fun than, I don't know, just straight programming, learning syntax and whatnot. I kind of saw something real. And I started playing around with Music 21 and the notebooks, and I realized that I could do this combination of prose, of code, visualizations. And one of the ways that Mike Cuthbert kind of presents Music 21 is that you can do music theory analysis of all of Bach's concertos in 5 lines of code or less. And when you can break something down to 5 lines of code or less, it becomes bite-size. And bite-size to the point where you can start learning and feeling like, okay, I can do 5 lines. Even if I can't do the 200 and something lines, I can do 5 lines. And so at the time, I was doing outreach at the Fab Lab in San Diego, which is a community makerspace that started at MIT's Center of Bits and Atoms and has kind of populated around the world. And we have sort of Saturdays were open days where people could just come in and create. And what I noticed were or younger folks were coming up to me and saying, oh, that's really cool. What does it do? And in the notebook, I was able to play music for them. I was able to show them, okay, you can create music with notes. You can convert music from the sheet music to Braille. And, and of course, you could play it and hear it. And that resonated. And they're like, that's programming? I said, yeah, that's programming. They're like, oh man, I would so totally do that. And that's when I realized Jupyter had this ability to be a game changer when it came to education. I know it's used in many other ways, but the way that really rocks my world is education. Jupyter Lab is a multi-windowed implementation of the notebook. One of the things that I particularly liked about the notebook was the simplicity of it. But I have grown to really like Jupyter Lab for 2 reasons. One is when I'm developing curriculum, I can have side by side the instructor guide and the student notebooks. And it does help to be able to see both. There's also some nice things about Jupyter Lab where you can pull out visualizations and have them running in multiple windows. You can kind of spin up little windows on the fly, but I will leave you there to explore it on Binder and shift a little to JupyterHub, which I've had the pleasure to work on the last few years. JupyterHub is a way to give a notebook to everyone in a group without people having to install stuff locally. As long as you have a web browser, you can consume the notebooks and interact with the notebooks. And at the time, I was doing workshops and outreach, teaching people how to use Python, and the single hardest thing was getting people with many different laptops, Chromebooks, whatnot, just getting them installed so that they could play around with the notebooks was a challenge. And by using JupyterHub and serving notebooks to folks, I realized oh my gosh, this totally simplifies my life, simplifies their life. Yes, at some point I do have to teach you how to install it, but it doesn't have to be the first day. And we don't have to kill that joy and wonder immediately. We've also, within the JupyterHub group, really worked hard to document how to deploy JupyterHub and on Kubernetes. And that has sort of simplified in many ways how do you get from 0 to actually up and running. Many folks, and you'll hear from some of them today who've, we have a couple trailblazers that have done really great work in education and using the notebooks. So I'm not going to go too much about how to use the notebooks and leave that to them because they are far better at it than I am. But Demaba is a professor at Harvard who is actually using the notebooks to teach his students, he's an electrical engineering professor, teaches students Python by basically giving them wearable electronic components and notebooks and saying, okay, create something for the real world, with not a whole lot of other bounds or structure around it. And he presented it at SciPy several years ago, and it was phenomenal what his students had accomplished in one semester. And I think that connection to the real world, particularly for women, is really important for engagement. And I know I would much rather make something that helps people than, you know, a widget thing that uses all the syntax in the world. That said, I also love and appreciate what people can do with code. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all, and I think the best things really come from using all the things you have around you. Binder is something that basically takes, you can take a GitHub URL, drop it in the interface there, press the launch button, and it will deliver you an ephemeral notebook out in the cloud where you can run and interact with a notebook and explore topics. And part of the reason this got funded by the Moore Foundation was to share reproducible research in science and have this one-click button where people could then load up the data that they've done with the research, and that you could validate that, yes, in fact, this person's research was accurately done. But it's also a great learning tool, and you'll see peppered around GitHub now these little buttons that say, you know, launch Binder, and you can actually build your own Binder hub, which it runs with JupyterHub underneath, and then, you know, the interface to actually launch it. And the hope is down the line that we will be able to federate this throughout universities and different education communities so that many people can have their own Binder services, because sadly at some point the money that we have from the Moore Foundation will run out. And we've been providing this service for free because Jupyter is a nonprofit research. You know, we come out of academia. We're not a big company. Even though the notebooks are widely used, this is the core group of people that are developing all the things within the Jupyter ecosystem, along with community members that are, you know, invaluable in terms of the contributions that they make on so many different levels. But, you know, there is some misconception out there that Jupyter is this big, you know, for money, profit making, blah, 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 blah. We're not. Most of us are academics at heart, and we like making cool stuff, and we like helping people learn. So if we look at a workshop or just teaching a class, I maintain that one of the most important parts of that is content. Engaging content helps learners want to learn. And then having the tools and the way in which you'll deliver information to students so that they can learn And then I think a really critical piece is getting feedback from the people that you are teaching. Is this working for you? Is this too hard? Is it too easy? Is the interface way too clunky? And I've learned a lot of stuff. Elizabeth kind of changed my thinking on how to deliver notebooks and how to use Git and GitHub when teaching adults. And Doug, who you will also hear from later, has done amazing work in laying the foundation of how do you use all these different languages with Jupyter and in things beyond just the sciences. And then to iterate on your content. And it is kind of this, over time, your lessons get better, the workshops get better. The notebook itself, Adam Rule, who's a grad student at UCSD, analyzed 1 million notebooks that were on GitHub. There's now over 2 million, but he found some really interesting themes in terms of how things were laid out. There's sort of the narrative stuff on one side and then the code and visualizations on the other side. And I think the best part of his paper talked about these different design things that we can do as the Jupyter community to make the notebooks even better, easier to teach with, and I encourage you to look at this. And as I said before, everything's on speaker deck. Quant Econ has done a phenomenal job of really showing what could be done with notebooks in terms of putting together a curriculum. They basically teach like an intro to economics course, but intermediate, in Python and also in another computer language, Julia. They've recently also kind of come up with a way to make it for an undergraduate or advanced high school curriculum as well. And I think it's a great example of seeing how you can structure things in notebooks. Another great example is by Jason Moore and Kenneth Lyons. They took a classical mechanical engineering textbook and went through each of the chapters and put together a meaningful notebook with great visualizations that help reinforce the concepts. And that really was one of the things. I was a double E as an undergrad. And when I was learning electrical engineering and calculus and whatnot, I was like, how cool would it have been to have some of these things? How cool would it have been to, as I was doing digital signal processing, if I had Alan Downey's notebooks on, just how to visualize stuff. And I think one of the great things about what Jason and Kenneth are doing, it's all open source, it's all open access. They are really kind of showing what you can do with digital textbooks. I had the pleasure, gosh, now it was probably almost 4 years ago, going to a tutorial that Jason did about, basically it was a series of notebooks that over the course of 2 hours walked you through how a human can balance. And the final notebook actually had this little visualization where as you adjusted the parameters with widgets, you could actually see somebody balancing and how the different forces and physics and mechanics all played into that. And then I think much of learning is also serendipity. It's like I remember going to the library or the bookstore and like trying to see, oh, what kind of catches my eye? And the ability to explore different things and find notebooks on topics that maybe you aren't making a career of, but hey, how does jazz work, in, improv or something? Or how do I look at text that's written and come up with the sentiment behind it? Is somebody angry? Is somebody happy? And going back to content, there is some really great open source content out there that maybe doesn't have notebooks yet, but has curriculum around it. One of which is California Academy of Science has actually done like a data, how do you interpret data, how do you put together data, how do you question data? And something like that combined with notebooks, I think would be a really powerful way. And I think reusing and remixing existing content is something that can be done fairly straightforwardly with the notebooks and with great results. And going back to music, part of what the cornerstone of what I'm going to share with students this summer is Music 21, which we talked about before. Alan Downey's done these great notebooks about digital signal processing and basically making a cacophony of noise. And Cyril Rosant, who has written several books about IPython and Jupyter, has a great synthesizer example where you use the notebooks and widgets to create a synthesizer right there on your screen. Google's got a fabulous project, and their research projects, Magenta for art and music generation, and Rise is a great tool for presenting and teaching, and you can interactively present information and actually work on code while you're presenting it, and it's pretty cool. So going back to the start, why do we learn programming? Why do we care about notebooks? And really, it's to learn and build things for other humans and build community. And one of the things that we are really great at in the Python community is offering workshops, sharing our knowledge, doing outreach, teaching teachers. This was really fun. This was in, I wish I had the sound, but in the interest of time I won't. But the actual talk has the sound. But these were teachers at Pi Academy in Cardiff, England during PyCon UK, and they had never programmed. And they were laughing, working together. They basically made this kind of soccer goal that with paper plates and a box, and I don't know if you can tell, the ball was these poor 3 little teddy bears that they had duct taped together, and when they kicked the ball and it hit the back, then the Scratch program that they were using would say, goal, and give you like this whole visualization. It was very fun. Another group of folks, Limor Fried, who founded Adafruit and is doing a lot of work with CircuitPython in the Python community, is actually somebody that I've known for probably at least 10 years when she was still a grad student. Somebody had emailed me, because I had done my graduate work at MIT, you have to check out this person's electronics tutorials. And I started reading them, and they were the best descriptions I had ever seen. And you know, she's gone on to offer kits, but a really big core part of Adafruit is all the learning resources they put together, and the fact that it's all open source, and the fact that, you know, she has these show and tells each week where, you know, kids, much younger than Josh, actually will display their stuff, and it's really pretty cool. So I encourage you, they are a sponsor at PyCon, and just a big supporter of learning and education in general. So we've got some folks from them here this week. They're going to be in the open spaces. So I guess just to wrap it up, my hope for all of you is you will go find something you're passionate about and immerse yourself in it, because it's worth it. Sharing it with other people is totally worth it. Thank you. And I will be around through all the sprints, so I will take questions then so that I don't get us further behind schedule. And with that, I will turn you back to Jessica.